Hello everyone, it's Half-Life Mike. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are back with Lord of the Rings Total War Remastered, and we're doing a faction guide and overview for the Easterlings. They don't actually appear much in the films. You see them march to the Black Gate, and then they are actually in the Battle for Minas Tirith, but it is seconds of screen time, blink and you'd miss it. They're one of the most distinctive looking factions in terms of their armor style. There's not really any factions that look like the Easterlings. They've got quite a comfortable starting position with Mordor to the west and the Men of Harad to the south, so you have a free run against the dwarves of Erebor and also the cities of Dale. So without further ado, let's jump into this one. I'm going to start with the unique characters and generals, then talk about the economy, then recruitment, lastly campaign strategy, and a full showcase of the unit roster on the battlefield. I'll begin with the general units. So the Easterlings start with 5 generals. You've got your faction leader Magor, your faction heir Imlach, and then 3 other generals. 5 starting generals is actually quite a good number. There's not many factions that start with more than that, although it is correlated somewhat to the number of regions that you start with. In terms of the model, all your generals have the same model, so I'll just pull one out now. It's got the familiar Easterling look and then an ornate design on the back. But as with all the models in this mod, I think they've done a fantastic job there. In terms of the actual bodyguard unit, that is called the Golden Scales. All your generals have the same bodyguard unit, including the ones that spawn in after the start of the campaign. In terms of how good this bodyguard unit is, it's probably middle of the road. I think the Elven factions have the best general's bodyguard units because they generally have +3 hit points, have defense of around 28 or 30, and then a decent melee attack as well. The stats on the base Golden Scales unit are that it has +2 hit points, defense of 21, and melee attack of 5. So its raw stats aren't as good as the Elven General's Bodyguard unit, but then it is more numerous. The faction leader and faction heir always has an increased General's Bodyguard anyway, but even on the other generals, like for example, Ulwarth has a unit size of 80 to begin with, and then it won't replenish above 60. But the main selling point of this General's Bodyguard over the other General's Bodyguards, which have potentially better stats, are that it is just more numerous. It is also worth noting that this is one of the only General's Bodyguards to have an armor-piercing weapon, which means that it ignores half the target's armor value, and this does give it an advantage offensively over some of the other General's Bodyguard units. So I think that's about it for the General's units. I'm now going to move on to the economy. In this section, I'm going to discuss how the economy works. Making money as the Easterlings is absolutely not a problem. They get access to loads of different economy buildings, so generating a steady income is quite easy. Just for context, I'm going to run through the different income streams. So every settlement will have a base farming income that can be increased by building more farmland. You then have taxes, which is dependent on the level of population and any modifiers you have on the tax rate. And then lastly, you have trade income, which is just based on the resources you have and how many settlements around about you can trade with. In terms of the economy buildings, the Eastlings get access to the farms, which generally is the bedrock of any economic system, because they give you population growth, which in turn allows you to get to the higher tiers of buildings and then also increases your tax income by having a higher population. The Eastlings get access to 2 tiers of the farms, which doesn't seem like that much, but then the slavery building line will also give you increased farmland. However, to build the farm building line and get the increased farmland from the slavery building line, that region must have hidden resource farm. So there's not that many regions that you start with or close by that have hidden resource farm. It will generally kick in a bit later in the campaign because a lot of the regions in or around Dale do have hidden resource farm. So it's just something to note, but it's not really a problem because you can generate most of your income through taxes in the early game. You won't need to rely on farming income till a bit later in the campaign. So that's the farming income. In terms of the trader then, or the trader income, these things do get access to the trade building line, like most factions do. They get access to 4 tiers of that. In order to build the trade building in a region, that region must have hidden resource men, elves, dwarves, or hobbits. So most regions that you start with and in the surrounding areas do have either hidden resource dwarves or hidden resource men. And then as you progress through the map and get to the elven factions, most of their regions and their surrounding rebel regions have hidden resource elves. So that's not really a restricted building. You'll be able to build that in almost every region that you conquer. It's really just the settlements in Mordor that don't have hidden resource men, elves, dwarves, or hobbit. So that's the trade income. A lot of factions can build ports. The Easterlings can't build ports. They do start next to the Rhun Sea, but actually none of the settlements around the Rhun Sea have the ability to build ports. So the nearest place where you would be able to build one, if you could, would be the coast, which is very far away. So the fact you can't build ports doesn't really hinder you that much. In terms of the other economic buildings then, so we've got roads. The Eastlings only get access to 1 tier of the roads, whereas some of the other factions get access to 2, like Gondor and the Elves. However, getting the movement range increased by 25% is still beneficial. In order to build roads in a settlement, that region must have hidden resource roads. Not every region will have that, particularly the ones which have forest areas or in the mountains. They usually don't have hidden resource roads, but just build them where you can because it makes getting units to the front line a lot quicker. Then one of the last economy buildings I want to cover is the mines. Mines are one of the most lucrative building lines in the game. In order to build mines in a settlement, you must have the resources to make that possible. So for example, in Ascol, you can see we've got the ore resource. So in this settlement, we would be able to build mines. These things get access to 3 tiers of the mines. Only the dwarves can get the 4th tier. But it's just to note that going for a settlement that has the ore is never a bad idea because the mines are so lucrative. And generally, it's the regions in the mountains that have that. So the last thing I wanted to cover, which is probably the most important part, is the Realm of Rhun building cards. So most settlements that you start with, and then in this area here to the west of you, have this Rhun or Realm of Rhun building cards, and that gives you a tax income bonus of 10% and also population growth. So it just means that you are able to generate massive tax income in most of your starting regions and the surrounding rebel regions. If, for example, we look at Roman, you can see we've got tax income of 1300 already. And by conquering these regions, you're able to generate huge tax incomes that can fund you through most of the early to mid game. So it's just something to note there. The slavery building line will also give you population growth as well as the farms. So when you get the population growth from the slavery, the building card, and the farms, then you can get massive population growth as well, which will in turn increase your tax income. Just as a note on the slavery building line, in order to build that, you need that region to have hidden resource men, farm, or gold. most of your surrounding regions to the northwest, which is where you naturally expand, do have hidden resource men, so generally that's not a problem. So that's probably everything there is to discuss on the economy, but as I said before, economy is definitely not a problem for the Easterlings. In the early game, you can rely on the massive tax revenues from the realm of Rhun, and then as you expand past the realm of Rhun, you can rely on the farming income from the slavery and farm building lines. And then, of course, you can supplement that with mining income from certain settlements. In this section, I'm going to talk about recruiting. Like with most factions, there are two primary recruiting buildings, the barracks and the forge. The barracks generally giving you access to your early to mid-game troops, and the forge giving you access to your mid to late-game troops. There are restrictions on these building lines as well as the units you can get from them, so just bear with me on this. You can build tier 1 of the barracks and the forge anywhere. However, to build beyond tier 1, you need that region to have hidden resource men. Additionally, to get tier 3 of the forge, you need that region to have hidden resource Rhun. So in terms of hidden resource men, the Easterlings are a human faction, as are the men of Harad. Most of the rebel regions around here are also inhabited by men, as are Rohan and Gondor. So there's a lot of regions which have hidden resource men on the map, including the regions that are close to you. So that's not going to be a problem. You'll be able to build tier 2 of the forge and the barracks in most regions you conquer in the early game. In terms of hidden resource Rhun, which gives you access to tier 3 of the forge, generally that's just the regions in the Rhun area, which is just the area to the west of your starting regions and then to the south as well. But there are still plenty of regions which have hidden resource Rhun. I did go through the files and count them up, and there was about 30, so that shouldn't be an issue either. There are a lot of regions where you'll be able to recruit your best troops, being from tier 3 of the forge. So that's the restrictions on the actual building lines themselves. In terms of the units you can get from the barracks and the forge, tier 1 of the barracks gives you access to your weaker clansman units. I don't really use them that much just because they take 3 turns to recruit, and you can get better units which take 2 turns to recruit, but they have the benefit of being able to be recruited from regions which don't have hidden resource men, because you can build tier 1 of the barracks anywhere and recruit these units, even if that region does not have hidden resource men. And generally, you have to get the barracks before you get the forge, because it's a requirement, so these units do have their advantages. From tier 2 of the barracks, you get your first Easterling looking units, the Easterling War Guards. These are a decent spear unit. Then from tier 3 of the barracks, you get your best archers, the Easterling Warbows. In terms of the forge, tier 1 will give you access to the Easterling Warriors, which are a decent sword unit. This is a unit I use most in my campaigns, even going into the late game. The stats are good enough that you can use them right through the length of the campaign. Tier 2 gives you access to the Easterling Warblades, which are a heavy infantry unit. They actually are not as good. Well, the stats don't look as good as the Easterling Warriors, but they do have the armor penetration, which gives them a selling point. And then the Easterling Great Armory gives you access to your elite tier units, the Red Dragons. But obviously you need hidden resource Rhun to get them. They're a very offensive unit, actually. High melee attack of 8. The defense is a bit on the low side, and they do take 3 turns to recruit, but decent unit size for an elite tier unit. Most elite tier units only have about 100 or less. So that covers the barracks and the forge, sort of generally, but there are some additional things to consider. So for the forge, there are some other units you can get. The Easterlings are the only faction in the game which get access to chariot units. So to be able to recruit chariot units, you need a region to have hidden resource Wain Riders. And currently there's only one region in the game which has that, which is Balchoth. So if you go to the forge in Balchoth, you will find the chariot units from tier 2, which are there, the Wain Riders, and then tier 3 also gives you access to an archer chariot unit. The chariot units in general are very strong in Rome Remastered, so if you want to kind of bulldoze your way through the game, that is one way to do it. Against, well, it needs to be against factions which don't have that high defense. It doesn't really work very well against the dwarves because they're so tanky. But just bear in mind that is somewhere that you can get the chariots just for a bit of variety. So the next point then on the barracks would be that there are some regions to the south of your starting settlements. You don't start with Ubersesh or Pasha. I've just taken them for the purposes of this video to show what I want to show. But Ubersesh is a region where you have the slaves resource, and that gives you access to some of the Variag units. So if you go to the barracks in the Variag region, you'll see that there are some Variag warriors, and there are some other Variag units like Variag cavalry, but currently you can't recruit them because there's no horses in this region. But I have spoken to one of the developers and they are adding more resources, so when you come to play it, there might be some additional cavalry units you can get from there. The next building to talk about in terms of recruiting is the stables, which gives you access to your cavalry units. So there are 2 tiers of the stables, and to demonstrate this I'm going to go to Pasha, because Pasha has the lesser horses resource and the horses resource. Not all regions will have both. Some regions will just have lesser horses and some will just have horses. The lesser horses resource gives you access to your weaker cavalry units, and the horses resource gives you access to your top tier cavalry units, as it is for most factions. But if we go to Pasha, because we have both lesser horses and horses, you can see both tiers of the stables. From the first tier you can get the Easterling Scout Cavalry, which are a skirmish cavalry unit, a javelin cavalry unit. They actually only take 2 turns to recruit, which is actually unusual for cavalry units. Usually it's at least 3. And then from the second tier of the stables you can get the Crimson Riders, which are your best cavalry unit. They do take 3 turns to recruit. Decent attack, slightly lower on the defense, but not many of the Easterling units have good defense. The unit size of 81 is pretty good for cavalry as well. But it's just there to, just want to show that there are stables you can get, and if you want to build the stables, it's the horses resource that you're looking for. I know the developers are adding in some more resources post the implementation of the new regions being added in, but currently the closest horses resources to your starting settlements are in Pasha, lesser horses in Rhun, and also in Balchoth, where you've got the lesser horses. And then there's also some in Dale as well, in Felgsgard, Lonsdale as well. So that's about it for recruitment. You've got 3 main buildings, or 2 main buildings plus the stables, and then as with most factions you've got your upgrade buildings as well, being the practice fields, practice ranges, master blacksmiths, and the training grounds. The Easterlings are a bit lacking in the defense department, so I'd probably recommend getting the armorer before getting anything else, the master blacksmith. But yeah, the units on the whole are just very numerous compared to a lot of the other human factions. If you're looking at the Eastling warriors, for example, they've got 180 men to their unit, and most infantry units will have between 100 and 140, so a lot of the strength just comes from the strength in numbers. In this section I'm going to talk about campaign strategy. So to get going economically, I would recommend trying to establish the realm of Rhun. So most regions to the west of your starting settlements, and then also around the Rhun Sea, have the Rhun building card here, which gives you a tax income bonus and population growth. So if you start conquering these regions, you'll be able to build up that income through generating massive taxes, and that will be able to fund you through the early to mid game. In terms of sort of unit or army composition and recruiting, I have found that one of your best units is actually recruitable from tier 1 of the forge. So if we go to the forge building line here, the Easterling smithy, that gives you your Easterling warriors. So the defense and attack they're mediocre, to be honest, but the unit size is massive at 181. Most melee infantry has a unit size of between 100 and 140. So the reason I like using this unit is because, firstly, you don't need to invest much into the military infrastructure to get them. You can obtain them from tier 1 of the forge and then invest the money you would have spent on later versions of the forge elsewhere, like on cavalry. The unit itself is not that expensive at 200 gold per turn, and while its stats aren't that high, they are good enough that when combined with the high unit size, it can overwhelm the enemy. And additionally, you can build the upgrade buildings to boost the attack and defense, which gives it relevance even late into the campaign. So in most regions, I would just build tier 1 of the forge and just build up stacks of the Easterling warriors. In terms of strategic direction, I'd say that's basically laid out for you, because you've got Mordor to the west and then the Men of Farad to the south. So the natural route for you to take is to expand west and then northwards, which will take you into the path of the Dwarves of the Iron Hills, Dale, and then Erebor. So I'm just going to discuss how to tackle those factions. Generally, the Dwarves are very tanky. All their units, even the low-level units, have plus hit points. So in a like-for-like fight, their infantry will beat yours 99% of the time. They're just better in the melee combat. There's not much you can do about that, but they do have weaknesses which you can exploit, and that is the fact that the Dwarf roster is full of melee infantry units. That's really all they have. They can get access to one archer unit and one cavalry unit, but that's in regions outside of their mountain regions, and generally when you fight against them, they only have their melee infantry units. So you want to exploit that weakness in that they are very immobile on the battlefield, and they don't have cavalry to answer your archers. So the strategy I usually pursue against the dwarves is to basically have enough archers in the army that you can flank and shoot them in the back, and the archers will be able to get most of the kills. So, as I was saying before, in the recruitment section, there is one, or you can get archer units from tier 1 of the barracks, being the clansman archers. And while the stats aren't very good, the next archer unit you get is the Easterling warbows from tier 3 of the barracks. It'll take you a while to get there, so in the early game, if you want to use archers, you really just have to use the clansman archers. You do actually start with quite a few units of them, though. You start with 5 units in total between your starting settlements, between Roman, Rhun, Mataram, and Baltroth. You've got 5 units of the clansman archers, so I would bring all those clansman archers over to this area, so you've got them for when you fight against the dwarves of the Iron Hills. But yeah, that's generally what I would do against the dwarves. You need a unit to be able to hold the line, which usually is just the Easterling warriors, and then you need to flank with your archers, so you're shooting them in the back, and they'll get most of the kills because your infantry won't get many. It's also worth noting that your general units have armor piercing, so that's also quite good against the dwarves as well because they have very high armor. So between the kills you rack up with your archer units and the armor-piercing general units, that should allow you to beat the dwarves. but they are quite difficult to deal with unless you have those archers, so try and get those. So even though you do start with 5 units, it's probably worth using at least one of your settlements to recruit the clansman archers, so that by the time you go against the dwarves, you've got armies of infantry and archers. So once you pass the dwarves of the Iron Hills and you move up to Dale, Dale is not that strong of a faction. They have sort of mediocre stats on their units generally, as long as you outnumber them, which you should, because you have very high unit sizes. That should be enough to beat them. And then you'll have to deal with Erebor. So the same strategy that you use against the dwarves of the Iron Hills will also work against Erebor. The difference being, by the time you get to Erebor, you've probably got your better arch units, being the Easterling warbows. So that should allow you to progress through Erebor more efficiently than the dwarves of the Iron Hills. So that's your strategy for dealing with the dwarves and Dale. The next faction after that would be the Mirkwood Elves. They obviously have very strong arch units, but their unit sizes are, well, in general, Elven unit sizes are very low, especially compared to the Eastling faction. So even though they have a lot of the good arch units, their ammo will only go so far. So the strategy I usually use against the Greenwood Elves is to just outnumber them. They also they have 1 unit of cavalry, the Riders of the Green, which is not too bad. But if you can bring in your own top tier cavalry, the Crimson Cavalry, then that can help take out their arch units and beat the Greenwood Elves. So yeah, I don't think there's too much to say on campaign strategy. Your route is kind of laid out for you, and Mordor usually do expand through the north here to meet you in Thorenburg or Rovanos. So by the time you got here, you do have a valuable ally in them. If you do push further, you can obviously go to the Elves of the Greenwood, which are quite difficult to deal with. But I think by the time you got there, you've probably just about won the campaign. So yeah, with that, I'll move on to the unit showcase. In this section, we're going to run through all the units on the battlefield. In general, the Eastling strength is the melee infantry units. Their stats aren't brilliant, but they have very high unit sizes, so you can overwhelm the enemy. They have some limited cavalry options, and they are also the only faction that has access to chariots. So without further ado, let's get into this one. I'll start with the Clansman Raiders, which are your most basic infantry unit. You can get them from tier 1 of the barracks. They cost 290 gold and then 130 per turn thereafter. Unfortunately, they do take 3 turns to recruit, which presents a disadvantage compared to some of your other early game units, which only take 2 turns to attain. Overall, it is a very weak unit. The melee attack of 2 is about as low as it gets, and the defense isn't much better. The redeeming feature is their unit size of 200, which is very high. It's only really the orcs or the goblins which have unit sizes that go above 200, but overall there are better options you can go for in the early game, so I wouldn't go for this unit. Up next, we have the Clansman Archers. Like with the Clansman Raiders, these also come from tier 1 of the barracks and take 3 turns to recruit. They cost 400 gold and then 180 per turn. These are your early game arch units. As you would expect for an early game unit, their stats are definitely on the lower end. The missile attack of 10 and range of 130 is about as low as it gets, and then the defense and melee attack means they're not going to do much in melee combat either. However, they are useful in the campaign because you need arch units to deal with the dwarves, just for that flanking archer fire. And your better arch units, the Easterling warbows, can only be accessed through a tier 3 barracks, so it can take a while to get to that point. Therefore, the Clansman archers are what I use in the early game to deal with the dwarves of the Iron Hills, which start quite close to you in terms of on the campaign map. So while this unit is not inherently that strong, they still fulfill a role in the campaign. Up next, we have the Eastling War Guards, which are a spear unit. You can get these from tier 2 of the barracks. They cost 450 gold and 200 per turn. Unlike with the clansman units, they only take 2 turns to recruit. Most factions have an early game spear unit, and this is the Easterlings equivalent. Even though the defense of 20 isn't that high, it's actually the most out of any of the Easterlings infantry units. So if you need a unit to hold the line, then this is the best unit for that job, or that the Easterlings have. Like with a lot of the Easterlings units, the unit size is very high at 181, and that's one of its redeeming features. The melee attack of 3 is definitely on the lower end, but I think that's just to balance out the high unit size. But this unit can definitely do a job in the early game. Up next, we have the Easterling Warbows, which are the best arch units the Easterlings have access to. These come from tier 3 of the barracks, cost 670 gold, and then 300 per turn. Like with the clansman archers, they also take 3 turns to recruit, but they do boast several upgrades over that unit. The missile attack gets a significant boost from 10 to 14, and the defense is actually doubled, so they are a lot more effective in the melee combat. Unfortunately, the missile range is reduced, and they have a low amount of ammo per soldier at 14. So even though they've got a really high unit size of 120, the ammo level overall is comparable to arch units with a much lower unit size, so you don't really see the benefit of that. However, as before, you do need arch units in the Easterling campaigns to deal with the dwarves, and as these are your best arch units, they are useful, especially for dealing with the dwarves of Erebor. But overall, a solid arch unit. Then we have the Easterling Warriors that you can get from tier 1 of the Forge. They cost 440 gold and 200 per turn. Like with the Easterling War Guards, they also take 2 turns to recruit. This is one of my favourite units from the Easterling campaigns, just because you can get them very early on. You only need the tier 1 Forge to get them. They have a very high unit size of 180, and while the stats aren't brilliant, they are good enough that you can use them for most of the campaign, especially if you upgrade them via the upgrade buildings. But overall, these are what form the backbone of my armies for most of my campaigns that I've done as Eastlings, so an excellent all-round unit, I would say. Most infantry units have a size of between 100 and 140, so 181 is definitely a step above that and will give you a major advantage in fights. Up next we have the Eastling Warblades, which you can get from tier 2 of the Forge. They cost 520 gold and 230 per turn. Like with the Eastling Warriors, they also take 2 turns to recruit. Looking at the stats, they do look worse than the Eastling Warriors, but the main reason they cost more and you can get them from tier 2 instead of tier 1 is because their weapon is armor piercing, which means it ignores half the target's armor value. That can be useful against the dwarves, for example, which are very tanky, but the Eastlings are one of the only factions that have a general's bodyguard that has an armor piercing weapon. So generally I just rely on the generals to provide the armor piercing. However, these units are there if you want to recruit them. It's not something I usually go for though. Then we have the elite warriors of the Eastling roster, the Red Dragons. These come from tier 3 of the Forge, cost 820 gold and 360 per turn. Like with a lot of the elite tier units, they do take 3 turns to recruit, but that's just to offset the power they provide. The defense is actually on the lower end, especially for a late game unit, but the strengths are the melee attack, charge, and unit size of 140. You definitely want to take advantage of that charge stat if you're using this unit, and likewise the added numbers will give you an advantage against other factions. Most elite tier units have sizes of between 80 and 100, so that's an advantage. Then we move on to the cavalry units. Most factions do have a form of missile cav, whether that be archer or javelin, and the Eastlings have this skirmisher unit. So, like with most skirmisher units, it does have a low range and low ammo, but the missile attack of 14 is not too bad. The defense of 10 and melee attack of 2 means it's not going to do much in melee combat, but you can use it to chase down enemy units. And lastly, the unit size of 60 is not too bad. Most cavalry units range from about 30 to 80, so this is on the higher end. Up next, we have the best cavalry units that the Easterlings have access to, which is the Crimson Riders. You can get these from tier 2 of the stables. They cost 840 gold and then 370 per turn. Like with most cavalry units, they do take 3 turns to recruit. In terms of how elite tier cavalry units go, this is probably slightly below that level. Most good cavalry units have a charge of 3 rather than 2, and the defense of 17 is on the lower end. The melee attack of 7 is solid though, and the unit size of 81 is again excellent. I don't think there's any cavalry units that go above 81, but overall it's just a solid cav unit. Then we have the chariot units. The Easterlings are the only faction in the game which gets access to chariots. They are both very expensive in terms of upfront cost and upkeep per turn, and they also take 4 turns to recruit. I do find chariots to be very powerful in Rome Remastered in general. You can basically just run through enemy lines and pick up hundreds of kills, so I don't think the stats are really that relevant to go through. However, there are 2 chariots available. One of them doubles up as an archer unit, whereas the other is just a straight melee unit. I tend to use the Wayne Riders as opposed to the Wayne Warlords because the Wayne Riders are more numerous, have a higher melee attack at 18, and I don't think the archer element to the Wayne Warlords is worth investing money, because most of your kills just come through running through enemy units. But I do like the fact that they have included the chariots in the unit roster just to give a bit of variety, and again they are very powerful as long as you're fighting against the right faction. In terms of fighting against the dwarves, for example, they're not that strong because the dwarves are very tanky, but against the likes of the elves and Dale, they are very powerful. Up next, we have the General's Bodyguard units, the Golden Scales. Compared to the Bodyguard units for Gondor and the Elves and the Dwarves, they're probably not as strong in terms of raw stats like defense and attack. However, they do have an armor-piercing weapon, and they are quite numerous as well. So that does present some advantages over the other General's Bodyguards. Up next, we have the Variag units. So there are 3 in total, and these can only be recruited in certain regions in the Far East. First up, we have the Variag Warriors. These actually have quite decent stats for an early game unit, especially since you can get them from tier 1 of the barracks. Their stats are better than the Easterling Warriors. However, they do have a lower unit size, but they are definitely usable in the campaign. Then we have the Variag Horse Archers. In terms of their archer stats, the missile attack and range is very low, but the ammo of 20 per soldier is very high for horse archers. So they are definitely usable in the campaign, like with the Variag Warriors. Last but not least, we have the Variag Riders, which are just upgraded horse archers. The missile attack of 15 is actually very high for a horse archer. That's nearly at the level of some of the elven units. The missile range of 100 is on the lower end, as it is for most horse archer units, and again, the ammo of 15 is definitely on the lower end, but in terms of non-elven horse archers, this is probably about as good as it gets, and the unit size of 72 is definitely good as well. So definitely one to use in your campaign. That's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.